Have you ever wondered what really happened inside a medieval tavern? Not the warm, cozy ones you see in movies, but the real ones, the filthy, loud, chaotic places where the ale was questionable, the floor was alive, and danger was never more than one spilled drink away? So, why were medieval taverns so filthy? Who actually spent their nights inside them? And what truly went on behind those smoky wooden doors? In this video, we're going to answer all of that, and a lot more. We're stepping straight into the real medieval nightlife, the messy, funny, dangerous, disgusting, human side of history that most people never hear about. Now, before we dive in, let's slow down a little. Imagine yourself walking down a narrow medieval street. It's evening. The sky is turning that deep blue that comes right before night. The air smells like wood smoke, wet dirt, and maybe something else you can't quite name. People are drifting home. A few are still out, finishing chores, feeding animals, arguing about something small and unimportant. And then, through all that, you hear it. Laughter. Shouting. A lute that definitely needs tuning. And the warm, flickering glow of candlelight leaking through a wooden window. That's the medieval tavern. And you're about to step inside. But before you do, let's be honest. Taverns weren't charming, or cute, or cozy rustic fantasy chic. They were rough. They were chaotic. And honestly, some of them were straight up nasty. Floors soaked in old ale. Walls stained with smoke. Tables sticky with things you don't want to think about right now. And a smell so strong it probably had its own personality. But here's the thing. These taverns mattered. They were the only place where you could get news, meet travelers, rest your tired bones, eat a hot meal, or forget your problems for a night. And because of that, everyone went. The rich, the poor, the workers, the wanderers, the criminals, and the people who were just bored. So let's answer those thumbnail questions properly. Why were medieval taverns so filthy? Because cleaning wasn't a priority. Water was scarce. People didn't think in terms of hygiene, and tavern owners were more focused on selling ale than scrubbing floors. Also, people spilled everything. Constantly. Who came to these taverns? Everyone. Travelers, farmers, soldiers, thieves, merchants, widows, workers, even priests, who, by the way, weren't supposed to be there, but definitely were. What actually went on inside? Drinking, eating, gossiping, fighting, gambling, singing, flirting, complaining, planning rebellions, recruiting soldiers, making deals, and occasionally, sleeping on floors that no one should ever sleep on. And here's the part where I exceed your expectations. This video isn't just a light look at taverns. I've dug deep. I've read medieval court records, looked at old maps, searched through dusty historical notes, and found stories from real tavern keepers and real visitors from hundreds of years ago. Some of these stories are funny, some are disgusting, and some are surprisingly sweet. But most importantly, everything you're going to hear tonight is based on real history, just told in a calm, chill, bedtime style, so you can relax while you learn something new. I've also taken inspiration from places historians don't always check, like old traveler diaries, forgotten poems, early legal complaints, and, yes, the occasional angry letter from someone who definitely got scammed by a tavern owner. My goal is simple: to pull back the curtain on medieval taverns and show you the side that movies never show. Not the fantasy version, but the actual gritty, human, funny truth. And don't worry, even though medieval taverns were chaotic and filthy, you're safe. You get to experience all the smells, sounds, and drama. without needing to sit on a flea-filled straw mattress or sip ale that tastes like wood chips and swamp water. So sit back, get comfy, and let the candles in your imagination flicker a little. We're going to walk slowly into the medieval night, toward the warm light of the tavern door. We'll step over the mud, push open the heavy wood, and let the sounds of laughter and chaos wash over us. And once we're inside, you'll see everything, the good, the bad, the filthy, and the funny, exactly as it really was. Tonight, the tavern is open, and you're about to learn the true story behind one of the loudest, dirtiest, liveliest spots in all of medieval life. Picture this for a moment. It's late. The sun has slipped behind the hills, leaving behind a soft orange glow that slowly fades into deep blue. A cool breeze moves through a small medieval town, carrying the smell of smoke from cooking fires and the scent of damp earth. But it also carries, well, a few smells we can't politely name. Let's just say the Middle Ages never smelled like lavender. The streets are narrow and uneven, made from dirt that turns to a sticky mess every time it rains. Half the houses lean slightly to the left or right, like they're trying to listen to each other's gossip. Dogs wander around looking for scraps. A couple of chickens dart across the road like they're late for something important. And somewhere far off, a church bell rings, telling everyone the day is done. Most people are heading home, ready to rest their tired backs after a long day of work. Farmers shuffle in with muddy boots. Bakers, covered in flour, close their shutters. A blacksmith wipes sweat off his forehead, his face glowing orange from the forge. Kids run home before their parents start shouting their names across the village. But not everyone is done for the day. Some people, actually, a lot of people, are just getting started. And they're all walking in the same direction. Their feet crunch on the dirt, their voices blend together in a soft, growing buzz. And if you follow that sound, you'll see it before anything else. A warm, golden light coming from a small wooden building at the end of the street. The tavern. Now, don't be fooled by the glow. From the outside it looks almost charming. A crooked sign swings gently in the breeze. Inside, you hear laughter, clinking mugs, maybe a lute being played by someone who probably thinks they're better at music than they actually are. A few men sit on barrels outside, already drinking, even though they haven't made it through the door yet. It's like medieval pre-gaming. The moment you step closer, everything becomes louder, talking, arguing, stomping, cheering. The smell also becomes, let's say, stronger. A mix of sweat, ale, wood smoke, cooked meat, and something mysterious that we'll pretend is old cheese. It's safer that way. But here's the thing. Even though the tavern looks chaotic and maybe a bit sketchy, this place is the true center of medieval nightlife. If you lived back then, this was the spot to be after dark. No movie theaters. No shopping malls. No TikTok. The tavern was the entertainment, the news station, the social media, the therapy session, the dating app, and sometimes even the courtroom, all squeezed into one small, smoky room. As you walk inside, your eyes need a moment to adjust. The whole place is lit by candles and oil lamps that flicker wildly every time someone opens the door. Shadows dance on the walls. The room is full, warm, and alive. Long wooden tables stretch across the floor, covered in mugs, bowls, and things that used to be food. The floor is, well, sticky, but you try not to think too much about it. In one corner, a group of workers talk loudly about their day, slamming their mugs on the table after every joke. A tired-looking woman wipes down a counter with a cloth that honestly might be dirtier than the table itself. A traveler warms his hands by a fire, staring into the flames like he's been on the road for months. A couple of men play dice, cheering every time the cubes hit the wood. And in the back of the room, someone snores loudly with their face flat on the table, completely passed out. Everyone in this room is here for something different. Some want food. Some want ale. Some want warmth. Some want gossip. And some want to forget whatever happened that day. But even though their reasons are different, they all end up in the same crowded space, breathing the same smoky air, stepping on the same messy floor, and somehow managing to enjoy themselves. And that's what makes medieval taverns special. They weren't fancy. They weren't clean. But they were alive. They were loud. They were human. Imagine being a medieval traveler arriving in a town after walking for hours. Your feet hurt, your clothes are soaked from the rain, and you haven't spoken to anyone all day. Then suddenly, you hear the noise of a tavern. You push open the door and the warmth hits your face. The room is loud, but in a good way. Someone hands you a steaming bowl of stew. A stranger nods at you like you're already part of the place. In that moment, the tavern feels like home. It didn't matter if you were rich or poor. A nobleman might drink in the private upper room. A soldier might sit near the fire. A thief might be hiding in the shadows. A group of farmers might be laughing over mugs of ale. A widow might be serving drinks. A pilgrim might be sleeping in the corner. And a priest, who definitely shouldn't be there, might be quietly having his third cup. The tavern brought everyone together. Even people who would never talk to each other outside those doors. It was the great equalizer of the Middle Ages. Once you walked in, sat down, and grabbed a drink, you were just another face in the crowd. And yes, the place was filthy. The floor was wet. The air was smoky. The tables were stained. But the warmth, the noise, the stories, the laughter, all of it mixed into something that somehow felt comfortable. The tavern wasn't perfect. Actually, it was the opposite of perfect. But it was real. It was where the night truly began. So as we start this journey together, remember this. Medieval taverns weren't the cozy, candlelit inns from fantasy stories. They were rough, chaotic, messy, and loud. But they were also full of life. Full of stories. Full of people who, after a long and tiring day, just wanted a place to sit down, drink something strong, and forget their troubles under the warm glow of candlelight. And tonight, we're walking right in with them. If you could step into a medieval town for just one evening and tell someone, "I'm going to the tavern," they might look at you like you just said half a sentence. Because back then, tavern didn't really mean just one thing. Medieval folks had taverns, inns, alehouses, and honestly, half the time even they didn't know which was which. These places overlapped, blended, and confused everyone, including the people running them. But each one did have its own vibe, and if you knew the differences, you'd know exactly what kind of night you were walking into. A tavern, for example, was basically the medieval wine spot. Not fancy, not royal, just a place where you'd mostly find barrels of wine stacked behind a counter and a bunch of locals arguing about things like taxes, or which neighbor's chicken was eating everyone's grain. Taverns attracted travelers, merchants, and anyone with a little extra money to spend. Wine wasn't crazy expensive, but it wasn't cheap either. So taverns were lively, a bit rowdy, and always full of opinions. Imagine a medieval version of a wine bar that didn't pretend to be classy. Now, an alehouse? Whole different story. Alehouses were the OG home breweries. People, especially women called alewives, brewed ale right in their kitchens. When a batch was good, they sold it. When a batch was bad, they still sold it, because life was hard and options were limited. The sign you'd look for was usually a branch or a broom hanging over the doorway. That was medieval advertising. No neon lights, no chalkboard menu, just a stick. Alehouses were cheap, warm, crowded, and mostly full of people trying to relax after days filled with hard work. If taverns were wine bars, alehouses were your friend's living room during a party that somehow started at 2 in the afternoon. And then there were inns, the medieval bed and breakfast, but with more questionable beds and louder animals. Inns were mainly for travelers who needed a place to sleep, eat, drink, and then try to sleep again because someone's donkey wouldn't stop screaming. Inns were usually on main roads or by town gates, because travelers were always passing through. They served food, ale, and sometimes wine, but the real business was the rooms. And no, you didn't get a private room. You didn't even get a private bed. Sleeping at an inn meant sharing a giant mattress with strangers who might snore, steal, or forget which side of the bed was theirs. So that's the basic trio: taverns for wine, alehouses for homemade ale, and inns for food, beds, and travel. They all served drinks, they all had noise, and they all had characters, but they each had their own personality. Now, who actually ran these places? Here's where things get fun. You might picture a big man with a beard wiping a mug, but a surprising number of medieval drinking spots were run by women. Widows, especially, kept alehouses and taverns going after their husbands died. Brewing ale was one of the most common jobs for medieval women. They handled the business, the brewing, and the customers, all while dealing with random accusations from neighbors who claimed their ale was too strong, too weak, or too magical. Next were ex-soldiers. After surviving battles, bad weather, and kings who didn't like paying their armies on time, many soldiers retired and opened taverns or inns. These guys were perfect for dealing with drunk guests and travelers complaining about muddy boots. And then you had the clergy. Yep, monks and priests. Officially, the church said that drinking too much was sinful. Unofficially, a bunch of churchmen owned taverns on the side. Sometimes legally. Sometimes secretly. Sometimes pretending it was all for good works, even though the only thing being worked was their wine supply. So, tavern owners were this fascinating mix of strong women, tired soldiers, and religious men bending their own rules. But medieval taverns didn't just appear out of thin air. They had history. Long before knights and castles, the Romans had places called taverni. These were roadside bars where travelers could grab food, wine, gossip, and sometimes trouble. When Rome collapsed, a lot of these spots survived. They changed slowly, turning into early medieval alehouses and taverns. After Rome, life got rough. People didn't have stable cities or fancy buildings, so they used their own homes. That's why the earliest medieval alehouses were literally someone's living space. Just a one-room house with a fire, a few stools, and a pot of ale brewing in the corner. As towns started to grow again around the 10th century, more people opened these places, and suddenly whole streets had multiple alehouses competing to sell their ale before it spoiled. Eventually, governments stepped in. Not because they cared about health. Oh no, but because they loved money. They started licensing taverns, taxing wine, taxing ale, taxing barrels, and basically taxing anything that moved. By the 13th and 14th centuries, taverns were everywhere. Some towns had so many that officials complained the whole city was drunk half the week. As towns grew bigger, taverns became the social hotspots. If you wanted news, you went to a tavern. If you wanted to meet someone, make a deal, hire workers, hear gossip, or start a small argument that ended in a wrestling match, you went to a tavern. They were loud, smoky, crowded, and full of life, the medieval version of a community center, but with more spilled drinks. Inside a tavern, you'd find merchants talking about prices, travelers telling exaggerated stories, musicians trying their best, and locals drinking away the stress of daily survival. People argued about taxes, weather, kings, bread prices, or absolutely nothing at all. Every night had its own mini-drama. So when you ask, what exactly was a medieval tavern? The real answer is simple. It was the heartbeat of the town. A place where everyday people lived their real lives, laughing, complaining, drinking, surviving, and connecting. Kings and lords might have shaped history, but taverns shaped the people who lived through it. Ever wondered why medieval taverns smelled so memorable? Let me tell you, it wasn't candles. It wasn't a few sweaty people. It was basically everything all at once. Walking into a medieval tavern was like stepping into a tiny storm of smells that your modern nose probably wouldn't survive for long. First, the floors. They were usually dirt, sometimes cobblestone, and almost always sticky. Why? Because spills happened constantly. Ale, beer, wine, stew, sometimes even milk or mead. If it fell on the floor, it stayed there. Floors weren't mopped regularly. Water was scarce, and scrubbing a muddy, sticky floor was considered less important than brewing another batch of ale. Add to that the occasional chamber pot, the remnants of animals wandering through, and general human stuff, and you start to understand why people sometimes gagged just stepping inside. Next, the walls. Most taverns had wooden beams and plaster walls. Smoke from fires and candles darkened them over the years. Sometimes soot was thick enough to blacken everything, giving the whole place that medieval cozy look, but really, it was just dirt and smoke. Occasionally, someone would scribble a crude drawing or insult on the wall. Sometimes it was political. Often, it was just a drunk spelling attempt. And let's not forget the air. Smoke, steam from food, the tang of spilled ale, and a hint of, well, everything else. Fleas and lice were basically part of the decor, and rats were sometimes seen lounging in corners, completely ignoring humans unless dinner was served. The smells would hit you all at once, like a punch of history right in the nose. Modern pubs smell clean and inviting. Medieval taverns smelled like life, chaos, and survival all mixed together. Now, despite all this, people still loved them. Why? Because the drinks were, mostly, safer than water. Tap water was often contaminated and caused diseases no one wanted to deal with. Ale, beer, and wine went through boiling or fermentation, which killed most germs. So ironically, these messy, smelly, crowded places were safer than your average water fountain. Just don't ask about the frogs, insects, and grit that occasionally ended up in your mug. That was considered normal. Speaking of drinks, what exactly were they serving? Ale and beer were staples, and sometimes mead or wine appeared on the menu. But keep in mind, medieval tavern owners didn't have a lot of rules about purity. Watered-down ale was common. Chalk, tree bark, or ash could be added to stretch a batch. And if a customer complained, well, the bark and chalk didn't argue back. Wine was often imported and expensive, but it wasn't always safe either. Sometimes barrels leaked, sometimes corks weren't sealed properly, and occasionally someone dropped a bug in. Guests didn't care much, as long as it got them drunk enough to forget the floor and walls. Food in taverns was another adventure. Stews, bread, cheese, and roasted meat were staples. But the stews could sit on the stove for days, or sometimes weeks, without being completely emptied or cleaned. This perpetual stew concept meant that each new batch just got added on top of the old. Spices were often thrown in to cover off flavors, and people adapted. If you survived a night at a tavern without vomiting, you considered yourself lucky. Parasites and foodborne illnesses were basically part of the experience. And yet, despite the filth, taverns were full of life. People from all walks of life gathered there. Farmers, travelers, merchants, soldiers, thieves, widows, clergy, if they could sneak in. Everyone had a reason to be inside. Classes mixed in ways that were impossible outside the tavern. The rich might complain about the smell, but they couldn't resist the news, gossip, and opportunity to meet people who might be useful or dangerous. Entertainment in taverns added to both the charm and chaos. Musicians played lutes, flutes, or drums, often badly but loudly. People sang songs, some bawdy, some political, most completely inappropriate. Dice games, early card games, and betting were common. If you were lucky, you witnessed a storytelling session that lasted hours, where travelers spun tales about dragons, kings, or really tall fish that probably didn't exist. If you were unlucky, a fight might break out over a spilled mug or a shouted insult, and the tavern quickly turned into a mini battlefield. The church had opinions, of course. Priests warned about sin, drunkenness, gambling, and moral decay. Sometimes they even tried to enforce rules, fines, or curfews. Sometimes they just ignored the noise while secretly enjoying a cup of ale themselves. Taverns were denounced, but they were impossible to ignore, because people needed them. No taverns, no social hub, no gossip, no safe, well, mostly safe, place to drink. Life in towns would have been far lonelier without them. So what does all this mean? Medieval taverns were messy, smelly, and chaotic. They were dangerous, unpredictable, and sometimes disgusting. Yet they were also vital. They were centers of community, news, entertainment, and connection. They allowed people to relax, laugh, fight, drink, and survive. In a world where life was short and often brutal, taverns were one of the few places where people could be human, all together. And when you really think about it, that's why taverns mattered more than just about any king, knight, or battle. They were the pulse of the town. The place where everyday people lived, laughed, drank, and argued about things that mattered to them. The floor might have been sticky. The stew might have been questionable. The ale might have had bark in it. But the tavern was life. Walking out of a tavern after a long night, you'd leave behind smoke, noise, laughter, gossip, and maybe a fight or two. You'd step back into the dark, muddy streets, and for a moment, the smell would follow you. But inside, for hours, you had warmth, stories, human connection, and a tiny escape from the harshness of medieval life. And honestly, that's exactly what made it worth it. Ever wonder what medieval people were actually drinking in those taverns? Spoiler, it wasn't just ale, and it wasn't always safe. But it was their lifeline, their daily ritual, and sometimes, a little bit of chaos in a mug. Let's start with the most common drink, ale. Ale was everywhere. Made from barley, water, and yeast, it was like the medieval version of beer, but without hops at first. It was thick, slightly sour, and often cloudy. The longer it sat, the stronger it got. People drank it morning, noon, and night. Kids sometimes drank it too, though it was weaker than what adults had. Ale wasn't just fun, it was safer than water, because the brewing process killed off most germs. In a world where rivers and wells were often contaminated, ale could literally save your life. But don't get too excited, it still tasted weird, and sometimes contained bits of barley or other surprises floating around. Then there was beer. Beer, as we know it today, was slightly different because by the 13th century, hops were being added. Hops helped preserve the beer, made it taste slightly bitter, and reduced the chance of spoilage. Beer became popular in towns where alehouses and taverns wanted a slightly more refined drink than straight ale. People who could afford it often preferred beer because it was smoother. But remember, smoother didn't mean clean. You might still find a bug or a piece of dust in your mug. That was just part of life. Next, mead. Made from honey, water, and sometimes herbs or spices, mead was the fancy, sweet cousin of ale. It was often reserved for special occasions, festivals, or wealthy patrons. Sometimes it was flavored with cloves, cinnamon, or whatever local spice the tavern keeper could get their hands on. Mead could be incredibly strong, so strong that a single mug could leave a commoner wobbling like a newborn deer. Wine, of course, was mostly for taverns rather than alehouses. Imported wine was expensive, so only townsfolk with coins, or travelers looking to impress someone, drank it regularly. Local wines existed too, though they were often sour or watered down. Wine barrels were prone to leaks, corks weren't always secure, and sometimes the wine went off. But medieval people didn't really care. They sipped, grimaced, and kept talking. Now, a few words on the not-so-great side of medieval drinks. Because let's be honest, hygiene wasn't a big deal back then. Wooden barrels weren't always cleaned. Cups were rarely washed between customers. Fleas, dust, and occasional insects were just part of the experience. Sometimes people added strange ingredients to cover bad taste: chalk, tree bark, herbs, or even ashes. Don't picture it as intentional poison. Most tavern keepers just wanted their drinks to taste okay, last longer, and get people drunk enough to come back tomorrow. And then there was the alcohol content. It varied widely. Ale could be weak enough that a commoner could sip all day, while wine or mead could hit like a hammer. People learned over time how strong a tavern's drinks were. Experienced drinkers could judge a batch by smell, color, and taste. Newcomers? Not so much. They often learned the hard way. Another fun fact: medieval taverns sometimes had house specialties. Maybe a certain spiced ale, a flavored wine, or a secret recipe for mead. These were marketing strategies in a very low-tech world. Patrons would come back for the taste, gossip about it, and swear loyalty to one tavern over another. Taverns weren't just about alcohol, they were about reputation, friendship, and bragging rights. But drinks weren't just for fun. They were social glue. Alehouses and taverns were where news spread, deals were made, and arguments started. People shared stories of wars, local scandals, or wild events. If you had a new invention, rumor you wanted to start, the tavern was the place to do it. And a few mugs of ale often helped lubricate the conversation. People were more honest, more daring, and more willing to start a fight over a lost dice game when drunk. Kids and teenagers sometimes drank too, but mostly weak ale. This might sound shocking, but in a time when water was risky, even weak ale was considered safer than the river. Monks would sometimes bless the brew, adding a spiritual twist to a safety precaution. Yes, medieval people had creative ways to combine religion, necessity, and fun. There were also seasonal and festival drinks. During holidays or religious festivals, taverns often had special batches brewed for the occasion. They might be sweeter, stronger, spiced, or colored. Patrons looked forward to these, and the tavern could make a small fortune. Imagine a holiday ale that only comes once a year. People traveled miles to taste it, argued over the recipes, and compared notes. It was a medieval version of a craft beer craze. And finally, a little humor from history. Sometimes tavern patrons drank themselves into very creative situations. There are records of people falling asleep in barrels, singing songs upside down, or arguing that their horse should get a share of the ale. Not everyone survived the night unscathed, but stories like that made the tavern the most entertaining place in town. So, what's the big picture? Medieval drinks were messy, varied, and sometimes gross, but they were central to life. Ale, beer, mead, and wine weren't just beverages. They were medicine, entertainment, social glue, and survival tools. Patrons drank to connect, to escape, to celebrate, and sometimes just to get through the day. And despite all the risks, spoiled ale, insects, overstrong wine, people kept coming back. Because medieval taverns weren't just about drinking. They were about being human, together. Stepping out of the tavern after a long night, you'd smell the mud, the smoke, and maybe a faint hint of spilled ale following you. You'd remember the laughter, the stories, the small arguments, and the warmth. For a few hours, the tavern made life in a messy, dangerous, smelly world feel a little more manageable. And that's why, despite all its flaws, people loved it. Medieval drinks weren't clean. They weren't perfect. But they were real, they were social, and they were unforgettable. And that, more than anything, made the medieval tavern a place everyone wanted to be, even if just for a little while. When we think about medieval taverns, most people imagine mugs of ale, spilling over, and maybe a roasted chicken leg on the side. But food in a medieval tavern? That's a whole different story. It was as messy, surprising, and sometimes questionable as the drinks. And yet, it was central to why people came, not just to drink, but to eat, socialize, and survive another day in a world where cooking at home wasn't always easy. First, let's talk staples. Bread was everywhere. Loaves could be thick, crusty, or almost inedible, depending on how good the baker was that week. Bread served as more than food, it was also a plate. People would put stew, cheese, or roasted meat right on top of their bread and eat with their hands. Knives were rare, and forks were basically unheard of. You ate with your hands, and maybe a spoon if you were lucky. Think of it like a medieval sandwich, not neat, but practical. Stews were the next big item. They were easy to make in huge pots over the fire, and they could feed dozens of customers with minimal effort. But stews were also tricky. Many taverns practiced something called perpetual stew. Basically, instead of emptying and cleaning the pot, cooks would just keep adding new ingredients on top of the old. Imagine a soup that's been simmering for days, maybe weeks, and then you get a fresh chunk of meat in it. People got used to it. It wasn't about hygiene, it was about survival. And honestly, it usually tasted better than it sounds. Herbs and spices could cover up most of the interesting flavors. Cheese was common too. Not the fancy kind you see on Instagram today, but local cheeses, sometimes hard, sometimes crumbly, often with a strong smell. People liked cheese because it kept well, paired nicely with bread, and didn't require cooking. It was also easy to portion, so tavern owners could sell small slices to customers who couldn't afford a full meal. Meat appeared too, though not as often as we might think. Taverns would roast chickens, ducks, or occasionally pigs. Beef and pork were rarer, depending on the season and the wealth of the town. The meat might be salted, smoked, or cooked with spices to help preserve it. Sometimes, if the tavern was clever, they'd serve it in small portions with bread and stew to stretch their resources. You could call it the medieval version of a combo meal. Fish was another staple, especially in towns near rivers, lakes, or the coast. Salted or smoked fish could be stored longer than fresh meat, making it a reliable option for tavern kitchens. On Fridays or during religious fasting periods, fish was essential. It was basically the medieval fast food solution. People would grab a piece, dip it in sauce or vinegar, and keep drinking ale while discussing the latest news or arguing over dice. Now, let's talk about sweets and desserts, which were rare but not unknown. Honey was the primary sweetener, used in mead, pastries, or sweetbreads. Sometimes tavern cooks would make small tarts or pastries for wealthier customers, but sugar was expensive and imported, so it wasn't common for the average person. A dessert in a medieval tavern was a treat, not a given. You had to be lucky or rich. Cooking in taverns wasn't glamorous. The kitchens were smoky, cramped, and full of flies. Fires burned constantly to cook stews, roast meat, and boil water. Pots were reused multiple times, tables were rarely scrubbed, and utensils were often shared between strangers. Hygiene standards weren't a thing, but patrons adapted. You either got used to it, or you didn't eat at all. And honestly, most people got used to it. The food might be messy or slightly questionable, but it kept them alive, fed, and ready for another night of drinking and gossip. Taverns were also social hubs for food. Sharing a table meant sharing your meal, advice, complaints, and sometimes a fight over the last piece of bread or the choicest chunk of meat. Strangers became friends over shared stew bowls. Deals were made over plates of chicken. Arguments could start over who got the last slice of cheese. And if a fight broke out, it was usually settled with a laugh, a spilled mug, or an accidental slap from someone waving a spoon. Another interesting fact: some taverns had house specialties, unique dishes or drinks that kept customers coming back. Maybe it was a spiced stew, a secret cheese blend, or a specially brewed ale poured over honey. These signature dishes were advertised with a simple word-of-mouth system. Patrons would brag to friends, "You haven't truly lived until you've had the black stew at Widow Margot's alehouse." Reputation mattered. The better your food and drinks, the more crowded your tavern. Seasonality also affected what was served. Spring brought fresh herbs and vegetables, summer added berries and fruits, fall offered preserved foods like salted meat and root vegetables, and winter, well, winter was mostly stew, bread, and ale. Tavern owners were clever about using seasonal produce to stretch meals and keep customers happy, even when ingredients were scarce. And let's not forget the smells, food and drink combined. Bread baking in one corner, stew bubbling in another, meat roasting over a fire, cheese sitting nearby, and ale spilling on the floor. The aroma hit you immediately. It could make you hungry, nauseated, or both at the same time. Smell was part of the experience, whether you liked it or not. Despite all the mess, tavern food created a sense of community. It was about survival, but also about connection. Patrons ate together, drank together, argued, laughed, and sometimes fought. In a world where life was unpredictable and often harsh, the tavern offered warmth, nourishment, and a chance to be part of something bigger than yourself, even if that something bigger smelled like old stew and ale. So, medieval tavern food wasn't fancy. It wasn't clean. And sometimes it was downright questionable. But it was real, hearty, and alive. Bread, cheese, stew, meat, and fish, all served with a side of gossip, laughter, and maybe a tiny brawl, made the tavern the heart of medieval towns. Without it, life would have been lonelier, quieter, and probably a lot less flavorful. And the next time you imagine a medieval tavern, don't just picture mugs of ale. Picture the bread, the stew, the roasted meat, the salty fish, the sweet honey treats, and the people eating it all together. That's what made it messy, chaotic, and unforgettable. That's why people came back night after night, week after week, year after year. Because food, drink, and human connection, even in the messiest, smokiest, stickiest tavern, were worth it. If you think medieval taverns were just for rowdy men looking for a drink, think again. The people who went there were as diverse as the drinks they served. Taverns were social hubs, rumor mills, and sometimes minor battlegrounds, and everyone, literally everyone, had a reason to be inside. Let's start with the obvious: local townsfolk. Farmers, craftsmen, bakers, and blacksmiths all stopped by after work. Imagine finishing a long day digging, hammering, or baking in a hot oven, then heading into a smoky room where ale flowed and the smell of stew filled the air. For many, this was the one place to relax, vent about taxes, or argue with your neighbor about whose pig was trespassing. Townsfolk were the backbone of the tavern crowd, bringing gossip, news, and a healthy dose of drama. Then there were travelers. In a world without cars, trains, or Uber Eats, people moved slowly and needed places to rest. Inns and taverns near roads, rivers, and city gates were perfect. Travelers came for a bed, a meal, and a drink. But more than that, they brought stories. Tales of far-off lands, weird customs, and strange creatures were the medieval version of viral videos. A single traveler could draw a crowd eager to hear a story about a distant king, a legendary battle, or a fish the size of a horse. The tavern gave these tales a stage, and in return, the traveler got food, drink, and sometimes coin. Merchants were another regular group. They came to trade, network, and learn what was happening in neighboring towns. Taverns were like business centers, only with more ale and fewer suits. Deals could be struck over a slice of bread and a pint, while arguments over prices sometimes ended in fistfights. But merchants knew the value of a tavern. It was the fastest way to meet people, gossip, and influence the flow of goods in the region. Soldiers and ex-soldiers were always present. After campaigns, they needed a place to relax, drink, and brag about their battles, or complain about their injuries. These veterans were often loud, intimidating, and sometimes prone to starting fights, but they also made the tavern feel alive. They had stories no one else had, and a presence that kept the atmosphere lively. Tavern owners generally tolerated a bit of rough behavior because soldiers spent money, and tips were a thing even back then. Women attended too, though not as frequently as men, depending on the town and social rules. Widows might run taverns, but women from other backgrounds could also come for a meal or drink. Some were there to meet friends, gossip, or conduct business. Some were entertainers, like musicians or dancers. And yes, there were also women who worked in more specialized professions, but we'll leave that for another story. The important thing is, taverns weren't strictly male spaces. They were community spaces, where women could participate in a limited but meaningful way. Clergy, surprisingly, sometimes made appearances. The church officially frowned upon drinking and gambling, but a few priests and monks couldn't resist the call of a good ale or a friendly conversation. They might sneak in quietly, sit in a corner, and avoid the ruckus. Others were bolder, visiting openly if the tavern was known to be a safe spot or if it hosted charitable events. The line between sacred and profane was blurry in medieval towns. Taverns often sat right in that gray area. And don't forget students and scholars, especially near universities or monasteries. They came to debate philosophy, practice Latin, or just enjoy a bit of freedom away from strict academic or monastic rules. Some were there to study the local culture, others were there to try ale for the first time. Taverns offered intellectual conversation as much as entertainment. Just picture a student arguing about Aristotle while a blacksmith loudly complains about taxes in the next corner. Chaos and brilliance side by side. Another interesting group, outsiders and vagabonds. Travelers without money, wandering minstrels, or even thieves often found their way into taverns. They might perform for food, charm patrons into giving coins, or simply observe the goings-on. Taverns offered a rare place where social boundaries blurred. If you had a talent, a story, or a convincing argument, you could find a place at the table. If not, you might end up outside until the next crowd showed up. Taverns were also gathering places for gossip and news, which meant almost everyone had a reason to be there. If a rumor was spreading about a new tax, a missing person, or an important wedding, the tavern was the place to hear it first. People listened, argued, exaggerated, and repeated stories, turning every visit into an informal news broadcast. And because drinks loosened tongues, truths, half-truths, and complete fabrications all mixed freely, you could learn a lot if you could tell fact from fiction. The mix of patrons created a unique social ecosystem. Different classes, professions, and ages mingled in ways that rarely happened elsewhere. Fights, jokes, trades, deals, and friendships all started and ended at the tavern. Even conflicts between neighbors could resolve here, sometimes peacefully, sometimes with spilled ale as a form of arbitration. Patrons learned who was reliable, who was talkative, who got drunk fastest, and who was a storyteller worth listening to. It was education, entertainment, and survival training all rolled into one. And yes, fights happened, often over money, insults, or misplaced mugs. But even fights were social in a way. They were watched, commented on, and sometimes joined in by other patrons. It was part of the theater of tavern life. You laughed, gasped, or shook your head, then continued drinking, eating, and gossiping like nothing happened. So, who went to medieval taverns? Everyone who had a reason, a need, or just a desire to escape for a while. Farmers, merchants, soldiers, travelers, women, clergy, students, vagabonds, all of them shared the same space. And in doing so, they created the heartbeat of medieval towns, the center of community, gossip, and human connection. In short, medieval taverns weren't just bars. They were living rooms, newsrooms, marketplaces, theaters, and classrooms. Patrons drank, ate, argued, laughed, and sometimes fought, but they were all there together, making life a little more bearable in a messy, chaotic world. The tavern brought people together in ways that few other places could. It was messy, noisy, sometimes smelly, and often chaotic, but it was life. And in a time when survival was never guaranteed, that made the tavern not just a place to drink, but a place to belong. When you think about medieval taverns, you probably picture drinks, food, and gossip, and you're right. But if you really want to understand why people came back night after night, you need to talk about entertainment. Taverns were noisy, chaotic, and full of surprises. Music, games, storytelling, and even fights were all part of the package. And honestly, it's what made taverns feel alive in a way that a quiet pub today just can't match. Let's start with music. Taverns often had musicians, either hired or performing for free in exchange for a meal or ale. Lutes, flutes, drums, and fiddles were common. Some players were excellent, others, not so much. Imagine someone banging on a drum while off-key singing fills the room, and then a tavern patron decides to join in with a loud voice. The result: beautiful chaos. Music served a purpose beyond entertainment. It encouraged dancing, drinking, and socializing. People moved, sang along, and often forgot about their daily troubles. Speaking of dancing, it wasn't exactly what we'd call organized. Taverns had enough space for a few people to dance, often in the middle of the floor. Sometimes it was a coordinated jig. Other times, it was more like bumping into each other while stomping feet and waving arms. Injuries were rare, but spilled drinks? Guaranteed. The tavern floor, already sticky with ale and muddy boots, became a kind of medieval slip and slide. Patrons didn't mind, it was part of the experience. Storytelling was another huge draw. Travelers, soldiers, and local characters would tell tales that ranged from heroic adventures to absurd exaggerations. Dragons, kings, lost treasures, and massive fish the size of horses all appeared in these stories. Patrons loved it. Listening to a story while sipping ale or nibbling on bread and cheese was entertainment, social bonding, and mental escape all at once. And if a story wasn't believable, someone would loudly argue against it, which made it even more fun. Games were everywhere. Dice, early forms of cards, and other gambling games were popular. People bet money, food, or even favors. Sometimes the stakes were ridiculous, like who could carry a mug of ale the farthest without spilling. Sometimes the stakes were serious, like someone betting the price of a week's wages. Fights often started over disagreements, cheating accusations, or just a little too much bravado fueled by ale. In taverns, games were a way to pass the time, test luck, and display skill, all while keeping the crowd entertained. And yes, taverns had fights. Some people see this as purely negative, but in reality, fights were part of the entertainment. They were often loud, messy, and unpredictable. Patrons might cheer for one fighter or try to mediate. Sometimes, the brawl was over money, insults, spilled drinks, or romantic rivalries. Other times, it just happened because a patron had too much ale and decided to kick someone's chair. Fights were social events in their own way. The tavern audience became part of the drama. Everyone watched, commented, and maybe even joined in. It was chaos, but it was fun. Special events happened occasionally. Taverns might host festivals, feast days, or competitions. Who could drink the most ale? Who could sing the best? Who could wrestle without falling over? Patrons competed, cheered, and laughed, and the winner often earned bragging rights, and maybe a free drink or a meal. These events created memories and stories that people would tell long after leaving the tavern. Entertainment in taverns wasn't just for fun, it was also a social tool. Music, games, and storytelling brought people together, created shared experiences, and helped smooth over conflicts. Patrons argued less, laughed more, and formed bonds that could last months or even years. Even fights, in a strange way, contributed to the social ecosystem. They reminded people who was strong, who was reckless, and who should maybe stay out of the corner near the fireplace. Another interesting point, tavern entertainment helped spread news and ideas. Songs often told stories about current events, wars, or local scandals. Stories exaggerated details, but the gist often reached the ears of everyone in town. Games and competitions sometimes created friendly rivalries between different social groups or neighborhoods. And gossip. That was everywhere, fueled by the drinks and the excitement of the evening. Entertainment wasn't just fun, it was a way to communicate, educate, and influence the town. Animals sometimes participated in the fun, too. Cats might stalk around the floor stealing scraps, dogs might nap in the corner or chase rats, and occasionally, a horse tied outside would neigh in rhythm with the music. Medieval taverns were messy, but life and chaos were part of the charm. You never knew what or who you'd encounter. Interestingly, tavern entertainment was accessible to nearly everyone, despite social hierarchies. Rich and poor mixed freely when music played, dice rolled, and stories flew. A nobleman might be seated near a commoner, and for a few hours, social distinctions blurred. The only rules were to drink responsibly enough to keep from embarrassing yourself, avoid starting a full-blown fight, and participate in the social fun. It was a medieval leveling experience. Messy, chaotic, but inclusive. So, what's the takeaway? Entertainment in medieval taverns wasn't polished, clean, or quiet. It was music that might be terrible but fun, stories that were exaggerated but thrilling, games that could start arguments or fights, and events that brought the whole town together. It was messy, chaotic, and unpredictable. Basically, exactly what made it exciting. Medieval taverns were more than just a place to drink and eat. They were theaters, concert halls, game arenas, and community centers all rolled into one. Patrons didn't just come to drink, they came to see, hear, compete, laugh, and sometimes fight. Every night was a little performance, every mug of ale a prop, and every storyteller a main character. And here's the best part. It worked. People came back night after night, drawn by the mix of chaos, camaraderie, and sheer unpredictability. It was fun, messy, and sometimes dangerous, but it was life. And in a world where life was often hard, short, and unpredictable, the tavern's entertainment gave people something priceless: connection, laughter, and stories to carry home. So next time you imagine a medieval tavern, don't just picture mugs of ale and sticks of bread. Picture music that might be out of tune, dice games with high stakes, storytellers spinning epic tales, dancing that looks more like chaos than art, and the occasional brawl that everyone watches in awe. That's what made taverns alive. That's why people returned. That's why taverns weren't just bars, they were the heart, soul, and theater of medieval life. Now, let's be honest, medieval taverns were not exactly what we'd call clean. In fact, if you walked into one expecting modern hygiene, you'd probably turn around, gag, and run straight back into the muddy streets. And yet, for all their messiness, taverns were essential to town life. They were messy, smelly, chaotic, and sometimes surprisingly safe, if you know how to look at it. Let's start with the obvious: the floors. Most tavern floors were dirt or rough stone. They were sticky with spilled ale, bits of food, mud from outside, and occasionally, worse, chamber pots, yes, were sometimes dumped nearby, because indoor plumbing was a joke in most towns. People stepped in it, spilled it, or ignored it completely. And yet, patrons didn't seem to mind much. For them, a sticky floor was just part of the experience. You learned to navigate it with care, or to stumble hilariously like the person who hadn't yet mastered the art of medieval balance. Then there was air quality. Smoke from fires, cooking, candles, and hearths filled the tavern. The smell of food mingled with the odor of unwashed humans, animals, and spilled ale. Fleas, lice, and other creepy crawlies were basically part of the decor. Rats everywhere. Patrons often had to watch their step and their mug at the same time, because a rat might be braver than a customer and hop onto the table. Despite all that, the air, strangely enough, wasn't always fatal. People adapted. Your nose got used to the smell, your skin built a tolerance to fleas, and your reflexes improved when dodging rats. Speaking of animals, cats and dogs were common in taverns. Cats were unofficial pest control, hunting mice and rats. Dogs wandered in for scraps or company. They added to the chaos, sure, but they were part of the ecosystem. Patrons didn't mind, because these animals often helped keep the food supply from being entirely consumed by vermin. A tavern without cats? Unthinkable. Now, on to the big one: disease. Medieval towns weren't exactly sanitary. Plagues, fevers, and stomach bugs were common. Taverns were crowded, so germs spread fast. But here's the ironic truth: ale and beer were safer than water. Rivers, wells, and ponds were often contaminated with human and animal waste, causing deadly illnesses. Brewing killed most germs, making a mug of ale or beer a surprisingly safe choice. Wine, too, was safer than water, though it could be risky if barrels weren't cleaned properly. So patrons might have smelled awful and floors might have been sticky, but they were drinking safer liquids than they'd find anywhere else. Cleaning, or the lack of it, was another factor. Tables were rarely scrubbed. Utensils were often shared. Mugs might only be rinsed in water, or not at all. Floors and walls were cleaned infrequently. Spills became part of the structure. You could literally see layers of ale on the floor that had accumulated over months, or even years. But patrons weren't grossed out. They adapted, learned the hazards, and made it work. That was medieval life. Messy, resilient, and surprisingly practical. Interestingly, taverns sometimes had rules about hygiene, even if they were minimal. Alewives or tavern owners might demand patrons wash hands before eating, or they'd frown on those who didn't bring their own utensils. These rules were inconsistent, but they existed. Officials occasionally inspected taverns to prevent the worst abuses, like obviously rotten meat or dangerous water. It wasn't perfect, but it was medieval law doing its best in a messy world. Another hygiene factor: personal habits. Patrons didn't bathe daily, water was scarce, and soap was expensive. Clothes weren't washed often. Hair was combed irregularly, and lice thrived. Tavern patrons accepted this as normal. A little stink was expected. A little grime was unavoidable. And yet, despite all this, taverns remained places people wanted to be. Why? Because warmth, drinks, food, and community outweighed a little, or a lot, of filth. The filth factor also contributed to the tavern's charm, in a strange way. Patrons adapted, learned, and laughed together. Someone slipping on a sticky floor became part of the entertainment. Rats stealing bread? Comedy gold. A fight starting because a mug was spilled? Social bonding. The mess created stories, memories, and shared experiences that were far more valuable than sterile perfection. And let's not forget diseases that spread via touch and air. Cold, flu, and stomach illnesses were everywhere. Taverns, crowded as they were hotspots. But paradoxically, people weren't constantly dying there. Exposure built resilience. Plus, if you survived a night at the tavern, you gained knowledge. Which areas to avoid, which mugs to trust, and who in town seemed to carry the worst illnesses. It was survival training disguised as socializing. Another point: filth didn't stop creativity. Taverns adapted with clever solutions. Floors were sometimes sprinkled with straw or sawdust to absorb liquids. Tables might be slightly elevated to avoid the worst spills. Cats and dogs were unofficial staff. Patrons became careful dancers, skilled jugglers of mugs, and master negotiators when passing around food. Chaos bred ingenuity. So, what's the takeaway? Medieval taverns were messy, smelly, and full of disease risks. Floors, walls, and air quality were all problematic. Animals, insects, and vermin were everywhere. Personal hygiene was limited. And yet, people flocked to taverns night after night. Why? Because taverns were alive. They offered warmth, drinks, food, stories, music, games, community, and connection. All of this outweighed the risks and discomforts. Patrons accepted the mess as part of life. And in a world where life itself was messy, the tavern became a sanctuary. Ultimately, tavern filth didn't kill the experience, it enhanced it. It made the place real, unpredictable, and human. Patrons laughed, argued, danced, told stories, and survived together. The mess, the smells, and the occasional disease were all part of the medieval tavern's identity. You left with stained clothes, maybe a hangover, and possibly a few fleas, but you also left with warmth, laughter, connection, and stories to tell. So next time you imagine medieval taverns, don't just picture ale and bread. Picture sticky floors, smoky air, curious cats, rats in corners, flies buzzing around, and a room full of humans doing their best to survive, socialize, and have fun. That's the filthy truth, and it's what made medieval taverns unforgettable. So far, we've covered drinks, food, patrons, entertainment, and the all-important filth factor. But medieval taverns weren't just chaotic funhouses, they also had a very interesting relationship with the law. Fights broke out, rules were bent, fires happened, and fines were handed out. Understanding this part of tavern life gives us a full picture of how wild, messy, and occasionally dangerous these places really were. Let's start with fights because, well, they were common. Taverns were crowded, smoky, and often fueled by alcohol. People bumped into each other, arguments escalated over spilled ale, dice games, or insults, and suddenly, fists were flying. Sometimes fights were one-on-one, sometimes they involved half the tavern. Patrons would cheer, take sides, or duck for cover. Taverns weren't exactly arenas, but in those moments, they felt like gladiator pits. Minus the lions, usually. Now, what did the law think about all this? Taverns were regulated, but inconsistently. Local officials or sheriffs sometimes made surprise inspections. They issued fines for excessive noise, unlicensed alcohol, illegal gambling, or fights that got out of hand. But enforcement was tricky. The law depended on witnesses, money, and luck. A tavern owner who bribed an official could keep running the business with very little interference. Meanwhile, a fight that didn't spill onto the street often went unnoticed. In short, taverns existed in a gray area between chaos and control. Speaking of rules, tavern owners often had their own internal laws. They weren't democratic, but they worked. No fighting near the hearth, no stealing drinks, no upsetting the musicians, small rules to prevent disaster. And if a rule was broken, the owner might demand payment, throw someone out, or even involve the town guard. Most patrons respected these rules because they wanted to keep drinking, eating, and enjoying the chaos. Breaking them meant missing out, and no one wanted that. Another legal factor: licenses. By the late Middle Ages, towns started requiring taverns to have licenses to sell alcohol. This wasn't just about money for the town, it was about control. Licenses helped regulate who could sell ale, where, and sometimes how strong the drinks could be. It didn't stop illegal alehouses from popping up. There were always those who brewed in basements or backrooms, but licensed taverns carried an air of legitimacy. They could flaunt their status, attract more patrons, and avoid fines. Now, let's talk about fires, because taverns were basically disaster waiting to happen. Open hearths, wooden beams, and crowded rooms were a dangerous mix. A spilled lantern or a flying ember could set the building ablaze in seconds. Fires were terrifying because towns were usually densely packed with wooden houses. One tavern fire could threaten the entire block. Owners did their best to manage the flames, but accidents were inevitable. Patrons often had to evacuate quickly, sometimes grabbing mugs, food, or even a sleeping dog on the way out. And yet, taverns kept opening, night after night, because people wanted warmth, food, and ale more than they feared fire. Fines were another form of legal interaction. Patrons could be fined for drunken disorder, cheating at dice, fighting, or insulting an official. Tavern owners could also be fined for allowing illegal activity or unsafe conditions. These fines weren't always massive, but they were enough to remind people that the law existed, at least in theory. Sometimes, a well-connected owner or a charming patron could talk their way out of trouble. Sometimes they couldn't, and chaos turned into a legal headache. Interestingly, taverns also mediated disputes. If two patrons argued and a fight didn't get out of hand, the tavern owner might step in. They'd arbitrate, settle a bet, or demand a small payment to calm things down. In a sense, taverns acted like informal courts. Patrons accepted the authority of the owner, partly out of fear, partly out of respect, and partly because it meant the fun could continue without interference. And yes, taverns sometimes became targets for law enforcement during political or religious unrest. If a town official wanted to crack down on dissent, taverns were obvious places to check. People talked, gossiped, and sometimes plotted in taverns. Authorities knew this, so they occasionally raided them to catch troublemakers or spies. That's part of why taverns had a reputation for being dangerous in more ways than one. Despite the risks, taverns were resilient. They survived fines, fights, fires, and inspections because they were essential to daily life. People needed them for drinks, food, socializing, and entertainment. Patrons learned to navigate the rules, avoid trouble, and even use chaos to their advantage. A clever person could start a fight to distract a guard, win a dice game, or spread a rumor, all while enjoying a pint of ale. The law also influenced tavern culture in subtle ways. Owners learned how to balance safety with chaos. Fights could be tolerated as long as they didn't escalate too far. Music and entertainment kept patrons occupied. Alcohol flowed, but within reason. Taverns were spaces of controlled chaos, where rules existed, but bending them was part of the fun. Patrons and owners alike knew that a little disorder was part of the experience, as long as it didn't destroy the building or attract too much legal attention. So, what's the takeaway? Taverns were messy, chaotic, and often unsafe, but they existed in a delicate dance with the law. Fights, fines, fire hazards, and inspections were part of daily life. Owners and patrons learned to navigate the rules, bending them when necessary, respecting them when needed, and sometimes outright ignoring them. Taverns were wild, yes, but they were also structured in a way that allowed human chaos to flourish safely. Mostly. Medieval taverns weren't just bars or eateries. They were arenas, theaters, courts, and social hubs. They were places where rules existed, but creativity, negotiation, and survival often overrode them. Fights could erupt, fires could threaten the building, fines could be imposed, but life went on. Patrons drank, ate, played games, laughed, argued, and survived, all under the watchful eye of both tavern owners and the law. Next time you picture a medieval tavern, don't just think about ale and bread. Picture the dice rolling across sticky tables, a heated argument over a spilled mug, a sudden fight breaking out and then being mediated by the owner, and the ever-present risk of fire. That's the reality of tavern life: chaotic, messy, sometimes dangerous, and yet absolutely essential to the heartbeat of the town. In short, taverns balanced chaos and order, filth and safety, fun and danger. And that delicate balance is exactly what made them unforgettable. They were places where life happened in all its messy, noisy, entertaining glory. If you thought medieval taverns were just about food, drink, and socializing, think again. Taverns were also hotspots for crime. Small scams, thefts, cheating, and other shenanigans were basically part of the package. In a world without police on every corner, the tavern was both a gathering place and a testing ground for cleverness, boldness, and sometimes sheer luck. Let's start with theft. Patrons, being human, often left their belongings unattended while grabbing more ale, chatting, or joining a dice game. Pickpockets were common, quick fingers slipping coins from pockets, purses from belts, or even small items off tables. Some were professionals, moving from town to town, while others were opportunists, someone who noticed a distracted traveler or an overly enthusiastic drinker. Theft wasn't just tolerated, it was expected. People learned to keep a hand on their coins, tuck purses under arms, or trust only a close friend. Speaking of games, gambling was everywhere. Dice, cards, and early forms of board games. Gambling was fun, exciting, and occasionally profitable. But here's the catch: cheating was rampant. Dice were weighted, cards were marked, and a sneaky player could win a lot more than luck would allow. Tavern owners often turned a blind eye because gambling attracted patrons and kept ale flowing. Patrons, however, learned to watch carefully and choose their opponents wisely. A wrong move could leave you broke or embarrassed. Con artists and tricksters were also part of the tavern ecosystem. Some sold fake remedies, magical charms, or dubious advice. Others offered elaborate stories designed to get coins from unsuspecting listeners. Imagine someone claiming to have a map to buried treasure, charging a few pennies for the secret details, and then vanishing into the crowd. Taverns were the perfect stage: crowded, noisy, and full of people eager for excitement. A clever scammer could make a tidy sum without ever leaving the building. Theft didn't only come from patrons. Tavern owners themselves could be sneaky. Some charged extra for special ale or meals, shorted servings, or added mysterious ingredients to increase profits. Others might pocket coins meant for the town or manipulate games to favor their house. In a world with minimal regulation, everyone learned to keep an eye on everyone else. It was a social game of trust and suspicion, and mastering it could make or break your tavern experience. Fraudulent merchants often used taverns to advertise fake goods or swindle travelers. A traveling merchant might claim to sell rare spices, textiles, or jewelry, knowing that the noisy tavern crowd would distract potential buyers from noticing the low quality. Patrons learned to haggle, question, and test goods, sometimes resulting in dramatic arguments, overturned tables, or even brawls. Taverns were places of commerce as much as entertainment, and the line between honest trade and fraud was blurry. And let's not forget drunken mishaps that counted as crime. A spilled mug, a stolen loaf of bread, or a pillow fight with a stranger could escalate into a full-blown fight. In some towns, law enforcement might intervene, issuing fines or detaining troublemakers. In others, the tavern owner's judgment was the final word. The key was knowing how far you could push the chaos without attracting serious consequences. Sometimes, crime and entertainment overlapped. Foolish bets and dares could be illegal or dangerous. Patrons might wager their possessions, perform risky stunts, or borrow items from others to win a game. A common game involved placing bets on how long someone could carry a heavy mug without spilling, often ending with broken dishes, bruised egos, or minor injuries. It was a mix of fun, risk, and law-bending that everyone accepted as part of the tavern experience. Taverns also had their own informal justice system. If a patron was caught stealing or cheating, the tavern owner often judged the offense. Punishments could include extra work, forced payment, public embarrassment, or even a quick ejecting from the premises. These judgments weren't perfect, but they were effective. Patrons quickly learned which behaviors were tolerated and which would get them into trouble, a practical lesson in medieval law and social norms. And yes, some taverns had connections to organized crime. Not the kind you see in modern movies, but local gangs, thieves' networks, and unscrupulous traders used taverns as meeting points. They planned heists, exchanged stolen goods, or recruited new members. Taverns were ideal because they were crowded, noisy, and offered cover for shady deals. Patrons might not even notice, unless they were unlucky enough to sit at the wrong table. Interestingly, crime sometimes boosted the tavern's appeal. Patrons loved drama, suspense, and the thrill of witnessing clever tricks or near misses. A skilled pickpocket, a witty con artist, or a dramatic fight became entertainment in itself. People returned night after night for the stories, gossip, and adrenaline rush, along with their ale and stew, of course. Taverns were messy, chaotic, and risky, but that's exactly what made them unforgettable. Another factor: social hierarchy and crime. Nobles or wealthier patrons were sometimes exempt from consequences that commoners faced. A wealthy traveler could cheat at dice with impunity, while a local artisan might be fined for the same behavior. This created tension, gossip, and occasionally brawls, all of which contributed to the tavern's lively atmosphere. People learned quickly who they could trust, who they could challenge, and who to avoid. So, what's the takeaway? Medieval taverns were not just drinking spots, they were hubs of crime, scams, gambling, and clever survival. Patrons and owners alike navigated a chaotic web of theft, fraud, and mischief while enjoying food, drink, and socializing. Rules existed, but bending them was part of the fun. Every game, every mug of ale, and every rumor could have consequences, and that unpredictability made taverns exciting. Taverns were messy, noisy, chaotic, and sometimes dangerous. But they were also places of ingenuity, social interaction, and human connection. Crime wasn't just a hazard, it was part of the culture. Patrons laughed, argued, plotted, and survived together, learning lessons about trust, skill, and human nature along the way. Next time you imagine a medieval tavern, picture dice rolling across sticky tables, a clever con artist weaving a tale, a pickpocket slipping coins unnoticed, and patrons gasping or laughing at the drama. That's not just crime, that's the heartbeat of tavern life, where risk, reward, and storytelling all mixed in with ale and stew. In short, medieval taverns were entertaining chaos. Crime, risk, and mischief weren't just side effects, they were essential ingredients. And that's exactly why these places have captured our imagination for centuries. Messy, risky, unpredictable, and utterly alive. If you thought medieval taverns were just for drinking, eating, and scuffles, think again. Taverns were surprisingly political places. They were hubs of gossip, negotiation, and secret plotting, the kind of spots where deals were made, rumors spread, and sometimes entire town policies were influenced. In short, taverns were messy, chaotic, and powerful. Let's start with the obvious: gossip and news. In a time without newspapers, radio, or social media, taverns were the main source of information. Travelers, merchants, soldiers, and locals all brought stories from near and far. Someone might arrive with news about a nearby battle, a noble scandal, or a royal decree. Patrons listened, repeated, and sometimes exaggerated these stories. By the end of the night, a single piece of news could have dozens of versions floating around the tavern, each more dramatic than the last. In a sense, taverns were early media hubs, shaping public perception and opinion. Political discussions were common. Farmers, merchants, soldiers, and even clergy debated taxes, local governance, and regional conflicts. Because the tavern was a social space, people felt freer to speak their minds. You'd hear arguments over a new tax, disagreements about the mayor, or speculation about distant rulers. Some debates were friendly, others got heated, spilling over into arguments, or even minor brawls. But in every case, patrons were engaged in politics, not through formal channels, but through conversation, persuasion, and storytelling. Some taverns were also meeting places for local leaders and influential figures. Merchants might negotiate trade deals over a pint of ale. Soldiers and veterans could discuss strategy or share intelligence. Town officials sometimes visited to gauge public sentiment. In some cases, secret agreements or plans for local projects were made in the smoky corners of taverns. The owners often encouraged this, knowing that influential patrons brought prestige and protection to their establishment. Taverns were also ideal for spreading political ideas. Think of them as medieval social media. Songs, stories, and gossip carried subtle or not-so-subtle political messages. A musician might sing about a corrupt official, a poet might tell a story glorifying a local hero, or a traveler might recount injustices in a distant town. These narratives shaped opinion, inspired action, and sometimes even encouraged rebellion. The tavern was where ideas traveled faster than anyone could have predicted. Interestingly, some taverns had connections to dissent or resistance. In times of political unrest, taverns were often places where secret meetings took place. Plots could be discussed in whispered tones while the music played loudly, hiding the conversations from curious eyes. A patron might pass a note under a mug of ale, or a traveler could deliver information unnoticed. These covert activities made taverns both dangerous and essential for those wanting to influence local or regional politics. Merchants and traders also used taverns to lobby for business advantages. If a merchant wanted to sway town officials or convince other traders to support a deal, a tavern was the perfect neutral ground. Drinks loosened tongues, music created a relaxed atmosphere, and shared meals built trust. Deals that might have taken months in formal settings could sometimes be arranged in one evening, all while patrons laughed, sang, and occasionally argued over spilled ale. Even ordinary patrons could wield political influence. If a local official or noble visited, the conversation and gossip generated in the tavern could shape perceptions. A well-placed remark or a cleverly told story might alter a decision or spark wider debate. Taverns were informal arenas where words mattered as much as coins, and where public opinion could shift with a single rumor. Of course, political activity wasn't always safe. Taverns were monitored, and some authorities kept an eye on gatherings that seemed too suspicious. If a plot was uncovered or a discussion got out of hand, patrons could face fines, imprisonment, or worse. That didn't stop people from speaking, though. In fact, the risk sometimes made conversations even more thrilling. Knowing you might be overheard added a layer of drama to the exchange of ideas. Another key point: entertainment and politics were intertwined. Songs, plays, and storytelling often carried subtle messages about rulers, taxes, or social injustice. Patrons listened, laughed, debated, and passed the stories along. Even a humorous tale about a clumsy noble could spark political commentary and discussion. In this way, taverns shaped opinion in ways that official proclamations could not. Entertainment made politics accessible, memorable, and sometimes dangerous, all at once. Religion and politics also mixed in taverns. Clergy might visit to discuss moral concerns, or patrons might debate religious edicts, fasting rules, or church taxes. While the church officially discouraged tavern visits, the reality was that spiritual and political discussions often happened side by side, fueled by ale and curiosity. People weren't just drinking, they were negotiating beliefs, authority, and influence, sometimes without realizing it. And don't forget, taverns were local hubs of intelligence. Travelers brought news from other towns, soldiers shared information from campaigns, and merchants reported trade disruptions or opportunities. Owners and patrons listened carefully, sometimes acting on information to gain advantage. A single piece of news could spark action, change plans, or even prevent disasters. Taverns were, in many ways, the medieval version of a think tank, noisy, chaotic, and slightly sticky. So, what's the takeaway? Medieval taverns weren't just places to drink and socialize. They were political theaters, places where ideas, power, and influence were exchanged alongside ale and bread. Fights, gossip, songs, and storytelling all contributed to the flow of information. Deals could be made, plans discussed, and opinions shaped. Patrons, owners, and travelers all participated, whether intentionally or not, in a web of political and social influence. In short, the medieval tavern was more than chaos and fun. It was a center of community power. It shaped opinions, inspired action, and even influenced local and regional decisions. Patrons drank, argued, laughed, and plotted. The tavern was messy, noisy, risky, and unpredictable, but it was also a vital part of medieval society. Without it, towns would have been quieter, lonelier, and less connected. Next time you picture a medieval tavern, imagine the smoky corners filled with whispers, a musician singing a subtly critical song about the mayor, merchants negotiating deals over ale, and patrons laughing while debating the king's latest decree. That's the political heart of the tavern, chaotic, lively, and strangely powerful. When you picture a medieval tavern, you might think of a smoky, crowded room with rickety tables, mugs of ale, and the occasional brawl. But have you ever wondered why taverns looked the way they did? The layout, architecture, and design weren't random. They were carefully suited to function, chaos, and survival. And yes, the mess and smell were, unfortunately, part of the plan. Let's start with the overall structure. Most taverns were simple, one- or two-story buildings made of wood, wattle and daub, or sometimes stone if the town was wealthy. Wood was cheap, easy to work with, and quick to replace if damaged, which was handy because taverns often saw fires, fights, and other disasters. Stone taverns were sturdier but more expensive. Either way, the construction reflected a balance between cost, durability, and function. Inside, the main room was always central. This is where the magic happened. Patrons drank, ate, gambled, sang, and occasionally fought here. Tables and benches were arranged to maximize space, allowing as many people as possible while leaving room for walking, dancing, or brawling. The hearth, usually centrally located, provided warmth, light, and a place for cooking. Everything revolved around this one chaotic hub. The bar counter, or serving area, wasn't fancy. It was often just a long wooden table or simple counter where alewives or tavern workers served drinks. Mugs, jugs, and bowls were stored behind the counter or on shelves. The goal was practicality, easy access for patrons, quick service, and minimal risk of spilling precious ale while moving around in a crowded room. The counter also served as a boundary, a neutral zone where fights were less likely to happen, at least in theory. Taverns often had side rooms or private spaces, especially for wealthier patrons or secret meetings. These areas allowed merchants, nobles, or officials to conduct business, negotiate deals, or plot without the chaos of the main room. These rooms weren't luxurious, usually just a table, chairs, and maybe a fireplace, but they provided privacy in a world full of noise and spilled ale. Sleeping quarters were common in inns attached to taverns. Rooms upstairs or in a back wing provided a place for travelers to rest. Beds were simple, straw-filled mattresses, rough blankets, and a roof over your head. Patrons might also share rooms with strangers. Privacy wasn't a priority, but safety, warmth, and shelter were. The layout reflected practicality more than comfort, though patrons rarely complained. After a long day on the road, a bed, even a simple one, was heaven. The kitchen and storage areas were vital. though often tucked away. Kitchens were usually near the hearth, connected to the main room. Storage rooms held barrels of ale, food supplies, and occasionally emergency firewood. Efficient placement minimized the distance workers had to travel, kept chaos somewhat under control, and ensured that food and drink could flow smoothly, even during the busiest nights. Taverns were often built close to streets, rivers, or town gates. Location was everything. Being near busy roads ensured a steady flow of travelers. Being near markets meant easy access to supplies. Taverns thrived on foot traffic, and their placement reflected this. Owners wanted to attract as many patrons as possible while staying accessible to both locals and visitors. Windows were few and small, which may seem strange. But large windows were expensive, hard to make, and a fire hazard. Small windows kept the warmth inside and the cold, rain, and wind out. They also helped prevent patrons from throwing mugs outside during fights, a surprisingly practical concern. Light was limited, so evenings relied on candles, hearths, and lanterns, giving taverns that cozy, smoky, and slightly eerie atmosphere we imagine today. Floors were usually dirt, stone, or wooden planks. Dirt floors were cheap, absorbed spills, and were easy to sweep, though not exactly hygienic. Stone was durable and easier to clean but cold and hard on tired feet. Wood was a compromise, warm, easy to repair, and practical for high traffic. Regardless of material, floors were often sticky with ale, food scraps, mud, and occasional surprises, a small price to pay for community and warmth. Ceilings and roof structures were designed to prevent collapse while accommodating smoke. Open beams were common, supporting the roof while allowing smoke to rise. That's right, ventilation was minimal, and smoke filled the room, which sounds terrible, but it helped keep some insects away. Chimneys existed but were rare early on. Many taverns relied on gaps in the roof or walls to let smoke escape. Patrons adapted by holding their mugs low and learning to breathe through the less smoky corners. Another clever design feature, stairs, ladders, and multiple levels in larger taverns helped manage different functions. Patrons upstairs slept, officials held private meetings, and workers moved between kitchen, storage, and serving areas. The layout separated functions without fully isolating anyone, keeping life in the tavern interconnected. Chaos happened everywhere, but it happened in a controlled way. Finally, taverns were flexible spaces. Tables could be moved for dances, games, or performances. Chairs could be pushed aside for brawls or celebrations. Side rooms could become temporary lodging or private negotiation spaces. The design was functional, adaptable, and built to withstand the unpredictable energy of patrons. Every architectural choice, from hearth location to window size, reflected the tavern's role as the town's social, political, and entertainment hub. So, what's the takeaway? Medieval taverns weren't designed for comfort or style. They were built for function, chaos, and survival. The main room maximized social interaction, the hearth provided warmth, kitchens and storage ensured food and drink flowed, and private rooms allowed negotiation and secrecy. Floors, walls, and windows balanced practicality with cost, safety, and climate. Every choice, even the sticky floors and smoky air, contributed to the tavern's unique charm. Next time you imagine a medieval tavern, picture rickety tables, a central hearth, small windows letting in little light, and floors sticky from ale and mud. Picture side rooms for secret meetings, stairs to sleeping quarters, and a layout designed for chaos, efficiency, and life. That's how taverns were built. Messy, functional, and unforgettable. When you think about medieval taverns, the first thing that probably comes to mind is ale, lots and lots of ale. But taverns were about much more than just drinking. They were food and drink hubs, feeding travelers, locals, and the occasional noble who wandered off the main road. What people actually ate and drank might surprise you, and it definitely wasn't Michelin star cuisine. Let's start with drinks, because, honestly, that's what most patrons cared about. Ale was the star of the show. Unlike modern beer, medieval ale was often weaker, thicker, and cloudier, but it got the job done. It was safe to drink, safer than water, which could be full of who knows what, filling, and cheap enough for most people to enjoy nightly. A pint could warm your belly, loosen your tongue, and make the sticky floor slightly less noticeable. Beer was another common choice, particularly in Northern Europe. It was slightly stronger than ale and brewed with hops, which gave it a more bitter flavor. Patrons loved it because it lasted longer, kept better, and, like ale, was safer than water. Wine was less common among the general populace, but in wealthier towns or in southern regions, taverns sometimes had barrels of red or white wine for those willing to pay a bit more. And yes, cider, mead, and other fermented drinks made appearances, depending on local crops and tastes. Hot drinks existed too, mostly spiced wine, broths, or teas made from herbs. These weren't everyday drinks for the average tavern-goer, but they provided variety, warmth, and a little comfort, especially during long, cold nights. The drinks menu was simple, but it covered most needs: hydration, intoxication, and occasional indulgence. Now, on to food. Tavern fare was hearty, practical, and designed to keep you alive and energized, not impress a modern foodie. Bread was the staple. Thick, crusty loaves or flatbreads were cheap, filling, and paired well with everything else. Ale-soaked bread was a particular favorite. Dipping a slice in ale before eating it wasn't just common, it was delicious, at least in a medieval sense. Cheese, salted meat, and fish were common accompaniments. Salted pork, herring, or other preserved fish were practical for taverns because they lasted longer and could feed many patrons. Stews were another staple. Cooked over the central hearth, these stews mixed whatever meat, vegetables, or grains were available. They weren't pretty, but they were hearty, flavorful, and most importantly, filling. For side dishes, patrons might find onions, cabbage, beans, and root vegetables. These were cheap, abundant, and could survive storage in less than ideal conditions. Occasionally, a tavern might serve pies, meat pies, cheese pies, or even fruit pies if the season allowed. Pies were portable, easy to eat while standing, and could double as a snack and meal. Now, let's talk about serving style. Meals weren't plated individually like today. Instead, food was often served in communal dishes or bowls. Patrons shared bread, cheese, or stew from the same pot, passing it around while arguing, laughing, and occasionally swatting away a curious cat. Mugs and bowls were reused, rinsed or not, adding to the overall experience. Sticky floors, questionable hygiene, and all. One interesting aspect: tavern food was often seasonal and local. Meat depended on hunting or butchery, vegetables followed the growing seasons, and preserved foods filled the gaps. A tavern near a river might serve fresh fish. A tavern in a farming town leaned heavily on grains, root vegetables, and preserved meats. Seasonal ingredients weren't a luxury. They were necessity. Patrons adapted, and menus changed accordingly. Tavern owners also had to balance taste with cost and preservation. Ingredients that spoiled quickly were used immediately or preserved. Salted, smoked, or dried foods were common. Strong spices were expensive, so herbs and local flavors were more likely. Despite this, clever owners made meals flavorful enough to keep patrons coming back. Ale and bread might be plain, but a well-seasoned stew or a slice of cheese could feel like a treat after a long day. Drinks and food were also social tools. Sharing a loaf of bread or a mug of ale built camaraderie. Eating together encouraged storytelling, gossip, and even the occasional prank. Someone might sneak a little extra salt into a stew, spill a drink accidentally, or argue over the last slice of bread. Mealtime wasn't just survival, it was entertainment, social bonding, and sometimes chaos. Another point: leftovers and waste. Taverns weren't spotless, and patrons often left scraps behind. Cats, dogs, and sometimes rats helped clean up, turning scraps into their own little feasts. Waste management was rudimentary. Food scraps often ended up outside or fed to animals. In a way, tavern life was a small ecosystem of humans, animals, and leftover meals, all interacting in one chaotic space. Now, let's not forget special occasions. Festivals, weddings, or local celebrations often meant richer food, more meat, spices, and even sweet treats. Taverns became the heart of communal feasts, accommodating large crowds and creating an atmosphere of abundance, even if the floors stayed sticky and the smell stayed strong. So, what's the takeaway? Tavern drinks and food were practical, hearty, and designed for sustenance, socialization, and survival. Ale, beer, wine, and mead kept people hydrated and alive. Bread, cheese, meat, fish, and stews filled bellies. Shared meals encouraged interaction, storytelling, and community. Seasonal ingredients, preservation techniques, and clever seasoning allowed taverns to feed many people efficiently. And yes, the mess, smells, and sticky floors were part of the experience, part of what made medieval taverns unforgettable. Next time you picture a medieval tavern, imagine mugs of cloudy ale, steaming bowls of stew, crusty bread passed around the table, cheese that smells like a challenge, and patrons laughing, arguing, and sharing stories over a hearty meal. That's tavern food and drink. Messy, practical, social, and absolutely central to the chaotic charm of medieval life. When most people imagine medieval taverns, they picture men drinking ale, arguing, and gambling. But women were everywhere in tavern life, running them, working in them, and yes, socializing in them too. Their presence shaped the experience in ways we don't always notice today. In fact, without women, taverns wouldn't have functioned at all. Let's start with who ran taverns. Contrary to some modern assumptions, tavern owners weren't always men. Women, especially widows, often inherited taverns from their husbands. They ran the day-to-day business, served drinks, and dealt with rowdy patrons. A widow with a tavern could be surprisingly powerful, controlling a hub of social, economic, and sometimes political activity. Running a tavern wasn't easy. It required stamina, patience, negotiation skills, and occasionally the ability to dodge a flying mug during a brawl. Other women worked as alewives or servers. They poured drinks, served meals, and managed the chaos. These positions required skill, balancing trays of mugs over sticky floors, keeping an eye on patrons, and making sure everyone got fed without starting a fight. Alewives often became central figures in the community, known for their sharp wit, memory for faces, and ability to calm disputes. In many ways, they were the unsung heroes of tavern life. Some women were cooks and kitchen staff, preparing meals for patrons while managing fires, smoke, and limited ingredients. Cooking in a tavern kitchen was a high-pressure job. One mistake, and a stew could burn or a fire could start. Yet women managed, keeping patrons fed and happy. Their work wasn't glamorous, but it was essential. Without them, the tavern would have been a smoky, empty room with mugs of ale and very grumpy men. And yes, women socialized in taverns, though not always freely. Some taverns allowed female patrons, others discouraged it. Women visiting taverns might be there to meet friends, enjoy a drink, gather news, or even discreetly conduct business. Their presence added layers to tavern life: stories, gossip, music, and social commentary. Women could influence the mood, calm disputes, and add nuance to conversations dominated by men. In some towns, clergywomen or nuns even ran or managed taverns, despite official church disapproval. These women sometimes provided food, lodging, or a safe meeting place for travelers. Operating a tavern was technically frowned upon by religious authorities, but practical needs often outweighed moral objections. Patrons benefited, and these women became respected figures in their communities. Women also played roles in informal law enforcement and mediation within taverns. A sharp-tongued alewife could stop a fight with a single word, demand restitution, or eject a troublemaker. Women working behind the scenes often kept chaos in check. Their authority wasn't always formal, but it was effective. Patrons knew that crossing certain women could be worse than angering the town guard, a lesson learned through experience, often painfully. Some women were involved in entertainment, singing, storytelling, or playing instruments. Their performances weren't just for amusement. They drew in crowds, increased drink sales, and added a cultural layer to tavern life. Music, humor, and storytelling enriched the atmosphere, making the tavern more than just a place to drink. Women entertainers could captivate a room, influence gossip, and even subtly sway opinions. Interestingly, women sometimes engaged in politics and business deals in taverns. A merchant's wife could negotiate trade deals, a widow might manage town connections, and influential women could gather information or influence decisions. Taverns weren't just male-dominated zones of chaos. They were spaces where savvy women could exercise power, influence, and strategy, all while keeping the mugs flowing. Of course, not all interactions were positive. Women faced harassment or danger in taverns. Rowdy, drunk patrons, brawls, and pickpockets made taverns hazardous. Women had to navigate social norms, assert authority, and use intelligence to protect themselves. Successful women in taverns often combined charm, wit, and force when necessary. It was survival, negotiation, and social influence all rolled into one. Taverns were also spaces where women could exchange news, gossip, and advice. Mothers, wives, widows, and daughters shared information about family, town affairs, trade, or local scandals. This informal network was crucial in a world without newspapers or mass communication. Women's gossip wasn't frivolous. It was a form of social power, keeping communities informed, connected, and sometimes mobilized. Another important point: tavern work provided economic independence for women. Owning or managing a tavern meant income, authority, and social respect. For widows or unmarried women, it was a path to survival and influence. Taverns were messy, chaotic, and challenging, but they offered opportunities unavailable in many other parts of medieval life. Women thrived, adapted, and left their mark on tavern culture. So, what's the takeaway? Women in taverns were essential. They ran the establishments, served drinks, cooked meals, mediated disputes, entertained patrons, influenced politics, and shared information. They faced danger, worked hard, and shaped tavern culture in ways both obvious and subtle. Taverns weren't just male spaces of drinking and chaos. They were spaces where women exercised power, creativity, and social influence. Next time you picture a medieval tavern, imagine not only the smoky air, sticky floors, and flying mugs but also the women running the show. Picture alewives pouring drinks with a sharp eye, cooks managing the kitchen chaos, entertainers singing in corners, and patrons both respecting and fearing these women. That's the reality of tavern life. Messy, lively, and powered by both men and women working, socializing, and surviving together. By now, we've talked about drinks, food, chaos, crime, politics, and the vital role of women in medieval taverns. But if you want the full picture, you can't ignore tavern culture itself. The stories, songs, superstitions, and traditions that made these places come alive. Taverns weren't just buildings with ale and bread, they were theaters of medieval life, where imagination, folklore, and fun mixed with daily survival. Let's start with stories. Patrons loved to share tales, some true, some exaggerated, some completely made up. Travelers brought stories from distant towns or foreign lands. Soldiers recounted battles, victories, and defeats. Locals told tales about haunted woods, strange creatures, or mischievous spirits. Stories weren't just entertainment, they were a way to teach lessons, warn of danger, or brag about bravery. A good story could make you laugh, scare you, or even inspire you, all while you sipped your ale. Songs were equally important. Minstrels, musicians, and even patrons themselves sang songs of love, war, and humor. Some were bawdy, some heroic, and some just downright silly. Music created atmosphere, distracted from chaos, and gave everyone something to focus on besides spilled ale or sticky floors. Songs also carried news and gossip. A catchy tune about a noble's misfortune or a merchant's clever trick could spread across town faster than any official proclamation. Taverns were also rich in superstitions. Patrons believed in lucky charms, omens, and rituals. Some carried small tokens for protection, while others avoided certain tables or seats considered unlucky. Tales of ghosts, spirits, or curses added thrill to the night. Some superstitions were harmless fun, while others shaped behavior. Never break bread with your left hand, never whistle after dark, or always leave a tip for the hearth spirits. These beliefs added layers of mystery and culture to everyday tavern life. Humor and practical jokes were a huge part of tavern culture. Patrons loved to tease each other, play pranks, or invent elaborate bets. Someone might convince a newcomer that the tavern cat was magical, or that a local ghost demanded a nightly toast. Jokes weren't just for laughs. They built camaraderie, tested patience, and sometimes resolved tension. A well-timed prank could prevent a fight, spark a conversation, or just make the night memorable. Tavern culture also revolved around games and competitions. Dice, board games, and drinking contests were common. These weren't just for fun, they were ways to prove skill, courage, or luck. Winning could earn respect, coins, or bragging rights. Losing could mean embarrassment, debt, or spilled ale. Games were social glue, keeping patrons engaged while providing stories for future nights. Everyone loved a tale about a daring wager, a clever trick, or a spectacularly messy loss. Storytelling, music, and games often overlapped with drunken creativity. Patrons inspired by ale might invent new songs, retell stories with dramatic flair, or create ridiculous challenges. Chaos fueled imagination. A drunken tale about a dragon in the market square might be repeated the next night, gaining new details and becoming part of local folklore. Taverns weren't just social spaces, they were cultural laboratories where stories evolved, songs spread, and legends were born. Another aspect of tavern culture was local traditions and festivals. Some taverns hosted seasonal celebrations, harvest festivals, religious holidays, or town anniversaries. These events involved food, drink, music, games, and sometimes competitions or performances. Patrons dressed up, sang, danced, and participated in rituals unique to their town or region. Taverns became the heart of communal life, blending celebration, superstition, and performance. Interestingly, taverns were also spaces for oral history. People shared news about politics, economics, or notable events. Patrons remembered details, repeated them, and spread them to others. Before newspapers and mass communication, taverns functioned as living archives of community knowledge. The stories might change over time, exaggerated for effect, but the essence, the social memory, persisted. Superstitions, storytelling, songs, and games weren't just entertainment, they also shaped behavior. Patrons learned which actions were clever, which were risky, and which were socially acceptable. Superstitions warned of danger or encouraged generosity. Stories inspired courage, cleverness, or caution. Songs carried moral lessons or humorous warnings. Games tested skill and patience. Tavern culture was a social curriculum wrapped in fun, chaos, and ale. Another cultural element: interaction with strangers. Taverns were crossroads, bringing together locals, travelers, merchants, soldiers, and officials. This mix created a dynamic environment where stories and songs from one place mingled with those from another. Patrons exchanged experiences, gossip, and jokes. Travelers could leave an idea, a tale, or a tune that would live on in the tavern long after they left. Taverns were, in essence, cultural melting pots, noisy, messy, but rich with shared human experience. And finally, tavern culture was inherently participatory. Everyone contributed, the owner maintaining order, the alewife serving drinks, the musician singing, the storyteller narrating, the patrons playing, joking, or gossiping. Even chaos had its place, adding energy and unpredictability. Patrons weren't just passive consumers, they were co-creators of the tavern experience. The culture of a tavern lived in the people, their interactions, and their creativity. So, what's the takeaway? Medieval tavern culture was a blend of entertainment, social bonding, superstition, and community memory. Stories, songs, pranks, games, and festivals created a living, evolving social space. Patrons weren't just drinking, they were participating in a cultural experience that shaped towns, preserved knowledge, and entertained for generations. Taverns were messy, chaotic, and unpredictable, but that's exactly what made them unforgettable. Next time you imagine a medieval tavern, picture not just the ale, bread, and brawls, but also the songs that lingered in smoky air, the stories that grew taller with each retelling, the superstitions that shaped behavior, and the laughter that echoed through sticky floors. That's tavern culture: chaotic, creative, social, and utterly alive. Alright, friends, we've reached the end of our journey through the messy, chaotic, and surprisingly wild world of medieval taverns. Hopefully by now, you've got a sense of what it was really like. The smoky air, sticky floors, spilled ale, dice games, gossip, schemes, and stories flying around like crazy. And if you're like me, you're probably thinking, wow, these taverns were basically the social media of the Middle Ages. If you enjoyed wandering through this chaotic, hilarious, and fascinating world, here's what you can do next. Hit that like button. Seriously, every like helps this channel keep making more videos like this, diving into strange historical stories, untold secrets, and weird corners of the past that you won't find in textbooks. Think of it as tossing a coin into the tavern's jar. It keeps the stories flowing and the history alive. Next, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell. Subscribing is like reserving your front row seat at our History Tavern every week. You'll get to hear all the stories, the weird, the wild, and the sometimes gross or hilarious, right when they come out. Trust me, you don't want to miss it. There's a whole world of untold history waiting, and you're invited to pull up a chair. And don't forget the comments section. Drop your thoughts, questions, or even your favorite weird historical fact. Maybe you've got a story that could inspire the next video. I read every comment, and I love seeing the community grow. This channel isn't just about watching history, it's about exploring it together, one crazy story at a time. Finally, take a moment to imagine the next adventure. We've been through crime, chaos, songs, stories, and secrets in medieval taverns. But there's so much more out there. Odd events, bizarre people, mysterious places, and unbelievable facts from history. And you're invited to pull up a chair, grab a mug of your favorite drink, ale, tea, hot chocolate, whatever, and join me for the ride. So, go ahead, like, subscribe, share, and comment. And most importantly, stay curious, stay entertained, and remember, history isn't just about the past, it's full of stories, chaos, laughter, and drama that are way more fun than fiction. Thanks for hanging out in the tavern today. I'll see you in the next video, and until then, keep exploring, keep imagining, and keep enjoying the messy, fascinating, and totally wild world of history. Cheers!